Hello, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. The Olympia FOR's TV program explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month's program proposes a creative and humane way to radically overhaul our criminal justice system. Everybody knows that our criminal justice system currently does not work. Despite paying lip service to victims, the current system focuses almost entirely on offenders. Despite paying lip service to, quote, corrections, unquote, the current system does not correct behavior, but just punishes it. Jails and prisons actually diminish inmates' ability to live civilly. They brutalize them and they turn them into hardened criminals. So this month's TV program will explore restorative justice, a totally fresh alternative to our criminal justice system. And we'll also explore applying similar restorative practices to other aspects of our society, including schools, workplaces, and families. I'm happy to welcome two guests who have a lot of knowledge and experience in restorative justice and restorative practices. Paul McCold started working on restorative justice soon after the early leaders laid the groundwork. He is a PhD criminologist and a research scholar active in restorative justice since 1993. Beth Rodman has done a lot of studying and experimenting with implementing restorative practices in a variety of other settings, and they've worked for 11 years, both of them, for the International Institute for Restorative Practices. Good to have you both here. Thank you for joining us.
Glenn.
Thank you.
We will have a good time on this show. Let's start by critiquing, if you would, Paul, how the current criminal justice system works. What are the basic concepts and the pattern that characterize the current criminal justice system?
Well, our current criminal justice system really grew out of a whole series of just experiences without really a systemic plan for what it was trying to accomplish, and it just sort of evolved without an overall coherent approach. Generally, it's based on ideas about retribution with the assumption that if we make it unpleasant for people to commit crimes, then they won't commit crimes, they'll be deterred from that. Or they'll see others who have been punished and will be deterred from committing crimes on that basis. So the existing criminal justice system basically asks three sets of questions. The first is what crimes were violated? Who's responsible for that, and then how shall they be punished? And the idea is that once we've determined who's responsible and the state has demonstrated or proven or gotten the offender to admit to the wrongdoing, then it's a matter of just finding the right kind of outcome for a case, either some rehabilitation program ordered by the courts, or some incarceration time or something, as if that's somehow going to solve the problem that was created that led to these kinds of incidents. So that the existing criminal justice system is, at least since the 1970s, really focuses, the primary response has been either incarceration, jail or prison, or the threat of incarceration to help make people try to behave better.
And then we know that the number of people in prison has just been skyrocketing for a number of years, and you have a visual that can can show that.
We have a graphic of that. Since 1925, the prison population had been remarkably stable up until around the early, late 1970s and beginning in 1980. Suddenly, the prison population in the United States skyrocketed, and this coincided with the presidency of Ronald Reagan and Get Tough rhetoric on crime. We've just been continuing to increase the number of people who are in prison. And one of the problems with punishment is when it doesn't work, then we're left with doing more. And when more doesn't work, then we're left with doing more. And eventually it sort of diminishes the deterrent ability of the justice system. And of course, the federal U.S. state and prison population is really a tip of an iceberg. It's a giant bureaucracy that's been developed, created to run these prisons, as well as a much larger number of people under correctional supervision in the community, probation and parole systems. All of that really created a very large prison, what's been called a prison industrial complex.
Yeah, and the contrast that you offer when you talk about restorative justice is a whole different paradigm. It's a whole different way of thinking.
It is really a very different way of approaching the problem of both what constitutes a crime and what response would constitute justice in response to that. And so for us, for restorative justice, crime is seen as wrongdoing, causes harm to people and relationships. And so if crime is about harm done to people and relationships, well, then justice should be about trying to repair that harm and make right the wrong that was done.
And then that relates with the actual victims, who are really basically excluded from the current system, because the way we think about crime nowadays in general is you broke a law that the state or the national level has, and so it's a crime against the government. And restorative justice brings victims back into the process.
Yeah, the idea is that the existing professionals in the criminal justice system basically steal the conflict from the victim, who oftentimes and most of the time reported the crime to begin with. So then it does become a contest against the state versus the individual, and the victim really is sort of left out of that. Primarily, most of the existing case processing, the offender eventually pleads guilty to some reduced charge or makes a plea bargain, in which case then the victim may not even testify at all and really has no standing in the case.
Right, and the victim just sort of gets washed away, and it's between the government and the offender.
That's right, and so restorative justice really focuses back on the harm that was done and the harm that was done to the individuals that happened to. And so we expect that the offender will take responsibility for what they've done, facing up to the people that they've harmed, and in a very direct, personal way, try to make amends for that.
And then, so the restorative aspect is that it restores the brokenness of community, it restores the relationship, it restores the victim, it restores the offender who's broken as well.
Well, we try to bring together all of the people who were affected by a given incident and sit in a circle and everyone talk about how they were affected, what their needs are now, and then we come up with a collective agreement about what needs to be done now to make things right. So it's really about making right the wrong as much as is possible, and especially making it right to the victim.
So what practices are there? How does it function? What would happen in a case?
Well, in a restorative process, where a case has been decided it's going to be handled in a restorative way, we would expect that the offender takes responsibility for what they've done. If they're denying that they're the ones who did it, or they have some excuse that they're not taking responsibility for, then they wouldn't qualify for restorative justice intervention. We expect that the offenders will accept responsibility for their behavior and be willing to face up to the people they've affected. So we bring together the family of the offender, the victim's family and support system, and into a large circle, and everyone talks about what's happened, and we come to a mutual agreement about what needs to be done now to make it right.
And so participation in this restorative justice process then is voluntary on each party's part.
Mostly. For the offender, it's a sort of a limited choice they have. It's voluntary. They have a right to have their case day in court. They have all of their civil rights are still available to them should they choose to want to contest the charge. They have a right to do that. If they choose to admit responsibility for what they've done and try to take a restorative approach, then this becomes an alternative. And of course, for crime victims, it's completely voluntary for them. We try to help victims understand what they have to gain and how they might benefit from this approach, but it's absolutely completely up to the victims.
Now, you have a diagram that contrasts these two models, and I wonder if you can walk us through that. It shows basically four sectors. Tell us.
Okay, well, what I call it the restorative discipline window, there's really 4 window panes, and really, if we're going to have control around individuals and the way we exercise control over children and in different settings, there's 2 separate dimensions to this. There's the aspect of control, which is seen as the vertical dimension on this chart, that you can have high or low control in the way you respond to another person who's done wrong. And then a separate dimension that's independent of the control, which is support. That is encouragement or nurturing the individual. And so we have these 2 contrasting dimensions of social discipline: control, which is limit setting or having high expectations for people's behavior, and support for them. And so our traditional punitive justice system, a sort of law enforcement approach, has very high on control, but very low on support. So it's all about exercising discipline through punitive means. Likewise, for social work kind of approach, we're concerned all about the individual and what we can do to help reform them. So that's all very high on support, but then there's very little expectation set limits on that, and so that would be permissive. And so we've used these shorthands of saying doing things to people, it's a punitive approach; doing things for people, it's a permissive approach. And of course, not exercising either control or support is really a neglectful approach.
So the quadrants, the neglectful approach of basically not doing much of anything is the lower left corner.
Yes.
The heavy control, the heavy authoritarian, lock them up and throw away the key approach, that's the upper left.
The 2 box,
And
yes.
the one that's all do-gooder but without any accountability is the lower right corner.
Right, doing for people.
And what you advocate is the upper right corner, which is strong on both control and support.
Yes, that is, it's not less expectation. We don't lower our expectations for behavior, and we hold people to a high standard of expectations, but we also engage them, the person, in helping them have what they need to be able to make right the wrong. So the only way you can get to this box that we're calling restorative, that is both simultaneously high on control and support, is to really engage with people and to seek a cooperative approach where we separate the deed from the doer, and we invite the person who's done the wrong to join with us to help figure out how they can make things right. And so we have this expectation that they'll cooperate with this process.
What kinds of crimes, what range of crimes is this working for? I know at the outset, when I first encountered this approach like 20 years ago, it was used mostly with like teenagers or young adults with like lower level offenses, but it's broadened out. Tell us what kinds of circumstances.
There's still a tendency in this country, in the U.S., to limit this kind of alternative approach to lesser serious offenses. We somehow think that in dealing with something serious, the only way to make that right is to inflict harm on the wrongdoer. There's a limited number of cases in the U.S. where they're actually doing this on more serious cases, but around the world they're actually taking on very serious cases with this. There have been a number of experiments in the UK and in Canada where they're dealing with burglaries and robberies, assaults, fairly serious offenses. In New Zealand, the country that really started this family group conferencing model in 1989, they've mandated this as the primary approach for all juvenile justice cases except for homicide. Everything else, all other serious cases, and they only deal with what we would call felonies here, have to go through a family group process before a judge will pass disposition. And cases that are less serious are handled in an informal way by the police.
Okay, now let's hold that in our heads, and then let's look at other areas with Beth about beyond the criminal justice system. This would seem to have wide applicability. Both you and Paul went to Pennsylvania in 1995 and learned from a model that was used in Australia. Tell us about that, and then let's talk about other ways of applying this.
Well, I should say first that we went to Pennsylvania after we had spent 2 or 3 years working with what we'd learned from Howard Zer's book, Changing Lenses. And this was, in going to Pennsylvania, we got to see a model of restorative justice at work for the first time. At that time, I was working with about 150 school districts in New York State, and I immediately saw that there was applicability to use this in a disciplinary way in schools. And we were also starting to recognize some of the principles underlying these processes, like treating all people very respectfully. You know, where it didn't matter whether this was the offender or the victim, we treated them both like they were invaluable human beings, and people really respond to that kind of treatment. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I did things wrong in school, I was not being treated like an incredibly valuable person. So that kind of respect certainly brought a great deal of effectiveness, and schools have been becoming unhappy places to be for both children and teachers. So I certainly thought there was a lot that we could do with it.
You folks had referred me to some websites, and I looked at a whole lot of studies where people have looked at schools in all kinds of situations, you know, serious behavior problems and classroom disruption and assaults and all kinds of stuff, and just all over the world people are documenting how well this works. It's just revolutionary.
This was used extensively in schools in Australia right after it began being used for criminal justice cases. The schools picked up on it almost immediately and were dealing with issues around bullying, especially bringing bullies and their victims and other students together in a process and really talking about how people are affected, and they found that it was very effective for that.
What else can you tell us about the schools? Because that was something that really caught your interest.
Let me mention 2 levels. As a person who's really interested in prevention, you know, I figured, number one, we don't have to wait for something to go wrong before we can start to try to make things healthy and a good place for human beings. But there's been, I would say that I know of 3 different districts, school districts in different parts of the United States that started to use this in a really robust way, like saying, we've got to really do conferences and do something about this. One of the schools was in Arizona, and I guess in Arizona, if children can be suspended from school for life, starting at about the age of 14 years old. And there was a principal who was just having schoolyard fights and kids getting thrown out of school permanently. And he wanted to change that. So he got the superintendent to support him while he just conferenced every school fight. And after like 3 weeks, the fights started to just disappear.
So what would a conference consist of then? Who would be there, and what process would they use?
They were using the conference model that Paul referred to earlier, where people who were affected were brought together in a circle. maybe the parents of the students would be there, as well as friends or people who had been involved in that. And sometimes it might have just been students and teachers. But things changed by doing these conferences. And I think that when adults pay attention to something, kids start to recognize it as, wow, this is important, and they actually care about what we're doing.
And the model, the conference model, sort of lends itself to the circle, like you said, rather than the kind of the top-down, here's the administration landing on that poor kid. But this is, there's more inclusiveness because the circle includes all the people involved.
Sure. Each person in the circle sits there with their own authority to speak into the circle. Children,
about their experience and their needs. And
students and actually citizens don't very often get asked to come in and tell what they thought and how they felt and what they think should be done. There's a lot of power in that, and human beings seem to respond to it because the effectiveness levels from all the research are astoundingly high.
So what would be the outcome after people have talked? Do they come to some kind of agreement about how to deal with that?
It depends on the nature of the incident, and again, what the what's happened in the past. Sometimes by the time we actually facilitate a circle around an incident, the young person's already been punished in several different ways, suspended from school, or his parents have grounded him, or he's experienced a number of different kinds of punishments, and so the less is expected, or the people feel less of a need for having some kind of consequences. Other times there's there's an underlying problem that needs to be addressed, and that gets recognized in the circle, and the person gets support for trying to engage in some kind of a reformatory reform program or a rehabilitation or treatment program that they might be involved in. Oftentimes it's really just a young person understanding how people were affected by their behavior is a surprise to them. They don't realize how many other people have been affected, and that is really part of the growth and learning experience we all need growing up, is to learn from our mistakes and to understand how we've affected other people.
Yeah, when I've heard you speak before about this, you mentioned how like the mother of the offender or other people, siblings or friends or other people who have some relationship with the offender can say things. So beyond the victim being able to say how they were affected, but just even within the offender's own network of people, the mother and others, it's like, wow, I was hurting all these people too. I didn't. People just sometimes don't have a sense of what the implications are.
We need to really rely on that existing social support system, the family. We've sort of forgotten about the family, or we treat the family as if they're part of the problem or are the problem with young people. And what we need to do is really re-engage that family and seek the strengths that the family has and provide the kind of support systems that the family needs to make a difference there.
When we were preparing for the program and talking on the phone, you mentioned how sometimes people have deficits in different areas. There could be some problem at school, or there's a deficiency in the family situation or some other setting, and so you mentioned these multiple dimensions. Can you tell us some more?
I think what you're referring to is I really care about I think that we as adults should be doing what we can to help children to grow up to be successful adults. And it's not just the job of the family or the school, but it's the many adults that surround that child. And the research pretty clearly shows that if young people have bonds to their family, to their school, to their church, or other community connections, that really strengthens them and is a very good predictor. The more bonds that they have, the better predictor it is of a healthy adult outcome, a productive citizen, exactly what we're wanting children grow up to be. So one of the things that I think restorative practices can do is to strengthen bonds, create bonds that will help to reduce risks that kids can run into.
Yeah, so if a kid is having trouble in school, if that's kind of a weak area, then maybe some of these other resources can be brought to provide the support, fill
Well,
in some
that's
gaps?
interesting that you say that, because I actually know that conferencing, as Paul described earlier, has actually been used for some academic cases. You know, there was a high school kid who was taking AP biology, and she was failing it. And the teacher felt terrible about it and had better expectations. Anyway, they pulled together a conference of her family and the teacher, and another person in the school ran it. And the parents realized that this was their third child, and they were maybe not being as involved as parents as they should be. And the girl was surprised that her teacher cared. She didn't know the teacher cared that she was failing. So, and actually I think it was that you could only miss 3 classes, and she had missed the 3. But the parents decided that they would become more involved. The girl was willing to pitch back in and try harder. And it was, you know, her academic life improved.
Yeah. So this goes beyond the notion of what had started out as an alternative to this dysfunctional criminal justice system. And so you're seeing applications, how it can help society in all kinds of other dimensions.
We've gotten to a situation where you have a problem or a dispute with your neighbor. Rather than going to your neighbor and saying, you know, I have this problem, can we talk about it? I think we need to come to some agreement about how we're going to handle this. Instead, we call the police and let the professionals take the problem away from us, and as if, you know, we're going to rely on them for solutions. And what we do is fail to know how to handle conflict in a constructive way ourselves.
So what you're proposing is really very empowering, because it helps people develop skills in resolving problems, and helps people take responsibility in a positive way, and it's solution oriented is one of the things that's exciting about this. Instead of like the old punishment, how can we hurt them, how can we put them down, it's like, how can we solve the problem?
And sometimes the solution is that an apology is made in this circle, and that people see that this young person is not evil, but made a really dumb mistake. And so the agreement has nothing additional added to it, because people have a very strong sense of satisfaction that we've listened to each other, we've heard each other, and this is taken care of now.
You've also looked at workplaces as another area where this kind of an approach would be very helpful. Tell us something about that.
Well, again, you bring these principles. I keep mentioning the principle of respect, and as the social discipline window that Paul showed you, that collaborative thing. So in the workplace, instead of the boss being very authoritarian and just telling everybody what to do and when to do it and how to do it, to be more engaging and to work with people and find which jobs people most want to do and which jobs people, and let them work it out.
Yeah, the bosses often will use pay lip service to a team, but it's really that's just a euphemism for the same old authoritarian model, and they don't really practice it. And what this would do would be, like I say, collaborative and respectful.
It doesn't mean that the boss is giving up their authority. It just means that they're seeking cooperation and input from the people.
And you find that if you use these kind of approaches in a classroom or in a workplace, you'll have much more effectiveness in the work. People will be happy to pitch in and do extra.
When you worked at IIRP, you used that in the workplace, and tell us how that worked.
We did. Well, you have to give it does take a little time, but the time gets paid back tenfold. We used some time, probably a couple of hours a month, where we did team building to build trust, to build relationships, and the kind of supervision that I did with individuals in terms of job satisfaction or job definition. It builds community, and it built a team, and people trust each other, rely more on each other. They know they're here to do a job, and that's what they do. They work beautifully.
How might restorative practices be helpful in family settings?
Well, I think that there are some things like family meetings that are promoted in parent literature that really are like restorative practices, where a family maybe has a regular 1 hour on Friday night where they come together and talk about problems or wants or money or job assignments. But again, if it's done in a collaborative way, children feel respected and are much more willing to pitch in, and they're given a greater understanding about why things are the way they are. Maybe money is limited.
So we've
Could
go
I
ahead.
add
Yes,
just a
please.
point about families here? It's interesting, as a criminologist, we've studied parental discipline, and the style of parental discipline is often a predictor of further delinquency among kids. And we've seen examples, and it's pretty clear now in the literature, that parents who are very authoritarian and very punitive in the way they handle wrongdoing in the family produce kids who tend to be violent and become criminals. Those who are very permissive and make excuses for their children often produce kids who tend to be self-destructive and engaged in drug abuse and other kinds of self-destructive behaviors. So that both the permissive and the punitive approaches there produce problems for kids growing up. And of course, we know neglect as a parental strategy is devastating for kids.
So all three of those other quadrants on the left side and on the bottom,
they directly apply to parental discipline and how that's exercised.
Yeah, and then the upper right where you have the restorative, the
So
with
having
approach.
sitting down with your child and helping them to understand why what they did was harmful and why it shouldn't be done, that was the approach. That's the collaborative approach that helps the child actually learn and is very respectful of them.
We've talked about some of the practical aspects. I wonder if each of you could share some of the sense of the research, because it's been documented just increasingly over the years. Tell us, from the criminal justice standpoint, how well restorative justice has been working according to...
It's always, when I'm asked that question, I'm tempted to ask, so how much evidence will it take to convince you that we should do something differently? And I don't know, oftentimes it's no matter how much evidence we have, I'm still going to stick with what I know. There have now been 16 randomized trials conducted in 5 different countries around the world, including the US. I was part of one of those experiments where we randomize either cases going to court or cases going to a family group conference, a restorative process, and compared outcomes, sense of justice and satisfaction of the parties involved. For crime victims going through a restorative process, we're getting between 95 and 100% crime victims saying they're satisfied that justice has been done. The recidivism rates are showing significant reductions for offenders who have gone through a restorative process. And one of the most dramatic findings is for crime victims who are suffering the effects of the stress of the crime or post-traumatic stress symptoms, an intervention where they come together and meet and face their offender and tell the offender how they've been affected and hear the offender apologize and make efforts to make it right. It really reduces the level of post-traumatic stress and dramatically. And that's been one of the most consistent findings that we've had. So there's both a reduction in reoffending rates, which is again so offender focused. There are other ways to get crime reduction besides individual reoffending rates. But for crime victims, this has been very empowering and really actually does allow them to get on with their lives and put this behind them.
Yeah, because the current system is just really quite dismissive of victims other than lip service.
Well, more and more we're doing some with victims, and we're being more sensitive to victims thanks to the victims' rights movement of this beginning in 1970s, that now pre-trial in court, we don't put the victims and the offenders in the same room together waiting their turn to testify. The courts have become more sensitive to that. There's also, often prosecuting attorneys' offices have victims agent departments who really are concerned with the welfare of the victims and helping primarily to ensure victims will testify and help support the case against the offender. And there's also, of course, a wide range of victim shelter programs and other victim support services that have evolved since then. But in terms of legal standing in the criminal case, it's really the state versus the offender.
Right. And the restorative justice model really seems, from what you've said, it's been proven to really meet the needs of victims much better, including reducing the rates of PTSD and helping with the healing and getting on with their lives.
Where it's
reducing
done
fear
well,
and-
it's really focusing around the victim's needs
Yeah.
and trying to meet those needs. And when we do that, when we really pay attention to what the victim's needs, it provides miraculous healing to everyone who's been affected.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the direct crime victim, but as you said, the parents of the offender, the brother or sister or sibling of the offender are also very affected by that.
Yeah. And go ahead.
And in terms of schools, when restorative practices has been implemented in a broad way, the disruptions in classrooms, dismissals, suspensions have all been large reductions. And when you do that, you're increasing instruction time.
Right.
And so I don't know that anybody's made a direct proof about this, but I would think that a broad application of restorative practices in a school would raise academic scores.
Well, I just read something today before in final preparation for taping the program about some school, a school system where they were concerned about this really horrible rate of people not completing high school. And then they look around and they find out that the high schools were expelling all these kids who were getting into trouble, and they realized, oh man, we're shooting ourselves in the foot here. And if they can handle these the students who have problems in a better way rather than expelling them, these kids would stay and complete and graduate from high school, and it would solve the academic problem.
There was a middle school in Minnesota that had a really high truancy rate, and they decided that they would, I think that if the student was truant 7 times, it became a court case. So they decided that every kid who had 4 truancies, they would run a conference. And what happened was that the school and the family came in oppositional to each other. But when the family heard that the school cared about the child, wanted them to do well in school, and wanted them to have good life outcomes, well, the family changed, and then the school and the family would together could say, so what's the problem and how can we resolve it? And the truancy rate dropped drastically because they worked together.
Again, it's a problem-solving model instead of a blaming model.
Yeah.
And we've been so stuck in the blame, whether it's through the criminal justice system or what do you deal with those kids in school or the whatever it is, that if we go to a problem-solving approach, all kinds of new things open up, like how can we collaborate to solve the problem?
Yeah, so there was a discussion early on in the development of restorative justice whether that was the best word for this, and there were those who advocated calling this relational justice because it was really about relationships that people have and how we need to rely on relationships as part of the solution to the problem. It's also restorative in the sense that we're trying to repair the harm that was done. So it's really focused on relationships and on repairing harm and meeting people's needs.
So if somebody watching this program were to say, geez, we should be trying this in our local community, either in our school system or in our as an alternative to the way the criminal justice system handles cases, how would people start moving toward experimenting or implementing?
First thing to do would be to educate yourself about this process. And so there's a number of excellent websites that would be available that you could begin to look and explore that. And so the one is www.restorativejustice.org. It's probably the most comprehensive in the world of this, and there's over 900 plus articles that are referenced and annotated there, as well as a world map. You can click on any part of the world and see all the activities that are going on everywhere. So I'd say begin by educating yourself. And do you want to talk about spheres of influence?
Well, no, actually, I was going to say that the International Institute for Restorative Practices has been quite a leader around restorative practices in schools, and they have some excellent materials, especially videos.
And that's www.iirp.org.
Right. And at the end of the program, we'll have both of those listed in the credits, restorative.justice.org and iirp.org.
What did you have in mind with spheres?
The spheres of influence, how people might use this. And so Beth tells a story about that each of us in our lives have a variety of circumstances and situations where we really have control of how things are happen around us and what we might do. And we can always choose to take a punitive authoritarian approach to problems, or we might choose very differently to take a collaborative relational repair problem-solving approach to those problems. And so we have the sphere that we have control over that we can exercise that. And do you want to?
Okay, this is actually a Stephen Covey concept. You have control over very little in your life, and you have also some influence. But if you work within what you have control over, your control expands and your influence becomes greater. So I think that that's what, but I was also going to say that one of the difficulties around criminal justice is that the criminal justice system is pretty stingy with their cases. The cases that they tend to release or allow to go to a restorative justice process are few and far between.
So the initial thing that you said was, without waiting for a program, without waiting for the school system to wise up, without waiting for the legislature to create an alternative, do it just where you can as an individual.
Absolutely.
And that's good.
There's a lot that we can do if we'll just educate ourselves about it.
We're running a bit tight on time, but I want to cover a couple of topics that you had told me about on the phone. One, we've talked about a little bit about respect and how that's an element of this. Is there anything else you want to say about respect as an element of this process?
I think I did say it. I'll just slightly recap, and that is that when you treat people as if they're the best of people, they tend to live up to it. People ask us about, oh my goodness, how do people behave in a conference? Does anybody hit each other? Do they yell at each other? No, they don't, because they've been treated so well coming into the process. People are very respectful to each other. So it seems to be a good contagious thing.
By modeling it as you develop the process. You also had mentioned to me on the phone right relationships and building community. And at that time on the phone, you said, don't wait for something to go wrong before you do that. And you mentioned this on the program a few minutes back.
Well, still using that model of the social discipline window, if you collaborate with people, invite in their ideas, work with them, create the common goal, you will start to build community. And when you build relationships within a group, whether it's a workplace or a school, then when something difficult happens, it's very easily remedied because we have relationships, we trust each other, we have a history.
Right.
And we're used to sitting in a circle and talking about things.
Yeah, during the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR, people talked about confidence building measures, that it's hard to jump right into like negotiating to abolish all nuclear weapons, but let's find some things that we can agree on, and we can start to build a track record of successful collaborations and negotiations and agreements and things. You start with the easy things, then when you need to talk about nuclear weapons, you've got a track record. And so it's just what you're saying. In the international field, they call it confidence building measures.
And we'd say you'd been building relationships.
Yes,
Or
exactly.
developing social capital. That's the other
Yeah.
idea. And so there's
Yeah.
this idea that Putnam came up with, that we really can draw on the relationships and the goodwill that we've generated and created with people when times are tough, and ask for that help.
We've talked about a number of examples in different parts of the world, and it seems to be growing, and it draws from, it's being developed in different areas, and in the research that you folks have done and what I've done to prepare for this, it looks as though people are drawing upon the traditions within the different geographic areas. In New Zealand, the Maori people and practices have lent some methods to how to do it, or Native American communities in Canada have done different
Also,
things,
there's
and so
a
forth.
significant population of Native Americans in the Navajo Reservation here in the southwest United States that have been running their own court system since 1985 using these approaches. And for them, this is drawing on ancient Aboriginal traditions of peacemaking.
I know that within various African tribes in Africa, they have these at the village level and that have been traditional. And so there are a lot of things to build on, and the research that I've seen shows that people, if they're savvy, will draw upon the local way of doing things, and it fits.
Thailand was very interested in this conferencing model because it drew on family and it fits with their their own ways. So they train something like 60 people to be running conferences in their country and have diverted 30,000 juveniles from the formal system now.
They call it Justice for Social Harmony.
Okay.
Which is
Same
it's
idea.
an idea.
Same
In
things.
fact,
Really.
we've discovered that really good police officers, really good teachers, really good parents have all just sort of intuitively used this
Yeah.
approach when they're dealing with people, that it's really quite natural. And so we tend to think that, getting angry and wanting to strike out is natural, and maybe that is, but there's also always been this sort of peacemaking, goodwill approach that has existed side by side, and so that's available in all cultures.
But we rely so much on the heavy-handed thing. It reminds me of the old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you'll treat every problem as if it were a nail.
Yes.
Yes.
And an eye for an eye will lead to a blind society.
Right,
yeah,
all that
so-
kind of stuff. But this other model does exist, and people need to
And I
live it.
really think it's a naturally human model. And if we could get back to our own indigenous village roots, this is probably what was going
And
on.
people feel good about doing it. I mean, the process feels good because you know that you're solving the problem and doing it humanely.
Yeah, there's been, it's amazing the level of satisfaction that people experience and express after these interventions. So,
I know you're trying to do some locally, and we would encourage people to contact your emails, which we'll put up with the closing credits if people want to follow up. And we want to certainly encourage people to educate themselves by going to restorativejustice.org and IIRP.org, because those are both just really great sources of information
and I would
lots of research.
encourage people to read this book that you have here in front of us.
Yeah, you mentioned that was important in your development, and I read this some years ago also. It was very good. Howard Zehr has written a lot of things. He comes out of a Mennonite background. The Mennonite Church and the Mennonite Central Committee have been very, very good.
And he's a fairly serious photographer, so changing lenses was his way of, changing paradigms.
I didn't know about his photography. But the book is very readable, very humane, very warm, and you go, wow, yeah, of course. So it's an excellent resource. What else would you like people to do who might be? Well, let's talk some more about what potential you see locally for some of this.
Well, we have already started an initiative that I call the Thurston County Restorative Justice Initiative, and we have a number of nonprofit organizations who are currently accepting cases being diverted from the courts, who are now beginning to explore this restorative justice. And of course, we have a longstanding dispute resolution center here in town that's been doing mediation cases for a long time, and are also part of this movement toward more restorative justice. As well as trying to get the schools involved. The local police department here, the Olympia Police Department's been very interested, and Lacey Police Department's expressed some interest. The county prosecutor's office is really quite interested in this, and they have a number of victim people there who are interested in exploring this.
Recently, I've been talking with Veterans for Peace and thinking about how can we use restorative justice and restorative practices in working with returning vets.
Yeah, I know a number of people within the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation are very much interested, and so it seems like it has potential to pull together people from throughout the community from different sectors and make something good happen. We would encourage people to make note at the end of the show of the email addresses and connect with you.
I have a growing email list of people that I will make regular contact with here as well. So.
Let's see. What else would you like people to do if they want to help? How could people actually get involved, get connected, practice it in your own life in areas that you have control over?
Well, one of the things I encourage people to do is to approach their public officials and ask them about restorative justice. Ask them about their opinion. What do they think of it? What they might do? So that can create sort of a political push to move more things.
Or to challenge their schools for how do you think that punishment taught anybody anything? Couldn't we do something that would actually allow them to learn?
Yeah, because the status quo is often entrenched and sometimes just doesn't know that there are better ways out there.
Yeah, or they tend to interpret what they're doing already as something that's a restorative approach, and we need to do a lot more education. But I think people, there's so much information now available through the internet that there's no reason people can't just educate themselves. There's some really great videos that are available on YouTube about restorative justice. I urge you to Google the terms restorative justice, do a video search on YouTube about restorative justice, and there's a lot out there.
There's one other thing I think I'd say. I think that some restorative justice programs have gotten started because victims have learned about this and said, I want that.
Yeah.
And it's hard for the criminal justice system to do
deny
anything else but. So if you know people who have had some kind of crime or involvement,
That's right.
let them know that, tell them to go to the criminal justice system and say, I want a restorative process.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's really an important constituency that has a big difference between the status quo
That's
versus
right.
this real solution.
Yeah, Howard Zare said that if you want to change the criminal justice system, what you first need to do is to change the way people think. And once you change the way people think about crime and justice, the criminal justice system will change as a result. So we need to start with thinking differently.
Could we invite a closing thought from each of you, and then we'll wrap this thing up?
Well, my thought was, and having observed this now internationally and around various places in the U.S. and really staying in touch with what's happening, is this works. It absolutely works. And because of that, and because people are so satisfied with it, it's coming, it's growing. It's just not a matter of if this will come, but when this will come. And there's just no reason to let people continue to suffer needlessly here when we could be doing a restorative approach now. And if we can't get this happening in Olympia, I don't know where and what hope there is for the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And I would say schools and workplaces can be places where everybody is happy to go to and can be happy while they're there, and I don't think we have enough of that.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Paul McCold and Beth Rodman, and we want to thank all the folks who've been watching. Our criminal justice system really is a failure. It ignores the needs of victims. It takes away offenders' ability to function in a civilized society. It fails to protect society, and it wastes tax dollars. On the other hand, restorative justice heals victims and offenders alike. Restorative justice custom tailors true justice on a case-by-case basis. It meets victims' actual needs and helps offenders to function responsibly. It restores community, and it saves tax dollars. And certainly the way governments are squeezed for money now, anything that's going to save tax dollars and produce better results, they've got to be pursuing. So our criminal justice system just focuses on punishing bad guys. And restorative justice asks, who's hurting? And what do they need? And how can we restore our community? It's not a liberal do-gooder approach. Practical experiences just all over the world show that restorative justice actually works. And our society is broken in other ways too. And Beth has been able to talk about schools and workplaces and other areas. People experience alienation and oppression in all kinds of parts of our society, and restorative practices can help restore respect for everybody and build a harmonious sense of community in a variety of settings. And so we encourage you to check the credits that'll appear at the end of the show with the websites and the email addresses. For information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093. We're all one human family, and we all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to do our part. And the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks.